The night I finally ran away from my husband wasn't the scariest moment of my 23-year marriage. The scariest was the morning I woke up and realized I'd stopped planning to leave, that I'd stopped believing I deserved to, that I'd convinced myself this was just what life looked like for women like me. Women from the wrong side of Kansas City. Women who didn't finish college. Women who married too young and loved too hard. The night we fled with nothing but our lives was terrifying. Yes, but it was also the night I remembered I was still alive inside. My name is Linda Baker, and I'm 72 years old now. But the woman I am today was born on that frozen February night in 1998, when I was 45, and finally, desperately understood that staying would kill me slower than leaving ever could. I'm telling you this story not because I want pity or applause, but because I know there's someone out there right now, listening to this while washing dishes or folding laundry or driving to work, who needs to hear that it's never too late. That the voice in your head saying you're trapped might be lying, that the years you've already given don't mean you owe the rest. And if that person is you, I need you to keep listening, because what I'm about to share isn't just my story. It's a roadmap I wish someone had given me decades earlier. But before I tell you about that night, before I describe the sound of my children's frightened breathing in the darkness, or the way my hands shook so hard I could barely turn the doorknob, I need to tell you how I got there. Because nobody wakes up one day married to a monster. It happens slowly, like water wearing down stone, until you don't recognize the shape of your own life anymore. I need you to understand that I wasn't always the frightened woman who flinched at footsteps. I was Linda Morrison once, a girl with hopeful dreams bigger than the cramped apartment where I grew up, bigger than the streets of Northeast Kansas City where everyone knew everyone else's business. I had plans. I was going to finish college, become a teacher, maybe move somewhere with actual seasons instead of just hot and hotter. I was going to be somebody. And then I met Henry Baker at a church social in the summer of 1974, when I was 21 and he was 23. And he looked at me like I was already somebody, like I was everything. That look was the first trap, though I wouldn't understand that for years. Now, I know some of you are already invested in this story, already wondering how a bright girl like I was ended up in a nightmare like I did. And I appreciate you being here. I really do. These stories matter. Not just mine, but all the stories of women who survived what we weren't supposed to survive. If you're finding value in what I'm sharing, I'd be grateful if you take just a second to hit that like button. It costs you nothing, but it helps this story reach other women who might need it. And please stick around, because what happens next might just change how you see everything. My mama used to say I came into this world asking questions. Born in 1953 in Kansas City, Missouri, at the old General Hospital on Hospital Hill, I apparently cried louder than any baby in the nursery that night. Making your presence known right from the start, Mama would tell me, with that mixture of pride and exasperation that defined our relationship for the next 18 years. We lived in a narrow shotgun house on Benton Boulevard. In a neighborhood where the houses stood so close together, you could hear your neighbors' conversations through the walls. My daddy, Robert Morrison, worked at the Armour meatpacking plant, coming home each evening smelling of blood and cold storage, his hands permanently stained no matter how hard he scrubbed. Mama, Dorothy, took in sewing and ironing, her fingers constantly moving, constantly working, constantly trying to stretch Daddy's paycheck to cover everything we needed and most of what we wanted. I was the middle child of 3 girls. My older sister, Patricia, was the responsible one, the one who always colored inside the lines and never talked back. My younger sister, Carol, was the baby, the one who got away with everything because she had Daddy wrapped around her little finger. And I was Linda, the one who asked too many questions, read too many books, wanted too much from a life that seemed determined to give us all as little as possible. Our neighborhood was a patchwork of working families, most of them white like us, some black families on the East End, where the invisible but very real lines of segregation were drawn. This was Kansas City in the late 50s and early 60s, where the civil rights movement was something we saw on our grainy black and white television, but didn't quite understand how it connected to our own struggles. Daddy said we all had it hard, just in different ways, and maybe he was right, though I understand now how much harder some had it than others. School was my hopeful escape. I loved everything about it. The smell of chalk dust and floor wax, the way my teachers wrote in perfect cursive on the blackboard, the weight of books in my hands that could transport me anywhere but Benton Boulevard. I was good at it, too, good enough that my 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Henderson, pulled Mama aside one day and told her I was surprised college material. College. The word hung in our house like Christmas lights, beautiful and melancholy, completely out of reach. College is for rich kids, Daddy said, not unkindly, just stating what he believed to be fact. Linda's a smart girl, but smart girls from our neighborhood become secretaries or nurses or teachers at the public schools. That's just how it is. But Mama, God bless her, had hopeful ideas. She started putting away money from her sewing jobs, hiding it in a coffee can behind the flour in the kitchen cabinet. "You're going to college," she'd whisper to me when Daddy was at work. "Maybe just the junior college to start, but you're going. You hear me, Linda? You're going to be more than this." I believed her. I held on to that belief like a lifeline, all through junior high and high school. While Patricia was dating boys and Carol was playing with dolls, I was studying, working part-time at the Woolworths on Independence Avenue, saving every penny I could. By the time I graduated from Northeast High School in 1971, I had enough saved, combined with Mama's coffee can money and a small grant, to enroll at Penn Valley Community College. Those 2 years were the happiest of my life up to that point. I took the bus to campus every morning, sat in classrooms where professors treated me like my thoughts mattered, studied in the library until they kicked me out at closing time. I was going to transfer to a 4-year school, get my teaching degree, maybe even get a master's someday. The world felt possible in a way it never had before. That's when I met Henry. It was June of 1974, right after I'd finished my associate degree. I was working full-time at the Woolworths now, saving money for the fall semester at the University of Missouri-Kansas City. Patricia had gotten married the year before and moved to Overland Park with her husband, an insurance salesman named Paul. Carol was 17 and boy crazy, driving Mama to distraction. And I was 21, caught in that strange limbo between who I'd been and who I was trying to become. The church social was Carol's idea. She'd been begging me to go with her, saying I needed to playful and have some fun instead of always having my nose in a book. Mama agreed, probably hoping I'd meet a nice boy and settle down like Patricia. I went mostly to get them both off my back, wearing a yellow sundress Mama had made me and feeling overdressed and underprepared for the social mingling that seemed to come so naturally to everyone else. Henry Baker stood out immediately, not because he was particularly handsome, though he was attractive enough, with dark hair and blue eyes and a smile that seemed genuine, but because he was watching me with an intensity that was both flattering and slightly unsettling. He was 23, electrician's apprentice, and when he finally worked up the courage to talk to me, he asked about the book I was carrying. Anna Karenina, I told him, prepared for the usual jokes about reading Russian novels in the summer. Instead, he said, "That's the one about the woman who throws herself under the train, right? Because she can't live without her lover?" I was stunned. "You've read Tolstoy?" He laughed, a deep, warm sound. "No, but my mama tried to make me cultured. I remember her talking about it. She said it was about how society traps women into impossible choices." I fell a little bit in love with him right then, not because of what he said, but because he'd listened to his mother, remembered what she taught him, cared enough about impressing me to mention it. Looking back now, I wonder if that was calculated, if he somehow sensed that intellectual respect would be my weakness. But at the time, I just thought I'd found someone special. We started dating that summer. Henry was different from the other boys I'd known, more serious, more ambitious. He talked about building his own electrical contracting business someday, about buying a house with a yard, about having a family. He listened when I talked about my plans to become a teacher, nodded in all the right places, told me he admired my ambition. "You're going places, Linda Morrison," he'd say, "and I want to be right there beside you when you do." The warning signs were there, so subtle I missed them completely. The way he'd get quiet when I talked about transferring to UMKC. The slight edge in his voice when I mentioned male classmates. The time he showed up at Woolworth's unexpectedly and got angry when he saw me laughing with a male coworker. "I just missed you," he'd said, but his fearful jaw was tight and his eyes were cold. I explained it away. He was jealous because he cared. He was protective because he loved me. He worried because the world was dangerous for young women. All the lies we tell ourselves when we're in love and don't want to see the truth. We got engaged that December on Christmas Eve in front of my whole family. Daddy seemed relieved, one less daughter to worry about. Carol was excited about being a bridesmaid. Mama looked concerned, but said nothing, just hugged me tight and whispered, sad, "You sure about this, baby girl?" I was sure, or I thought I was. Henry had a steady job, prospects for advancement, and he loved me. What else mattered? The fact that I'd quietly withdrawn my application to UMKC seemed like a reasonable sacrifice. We'd need to save money for the wedding, for a place to live. I could always go back to school later, once we were settled. There would be time. We got married on a sticky Saturday afternoon in July 1975 at the same church where we'd met a year earlier. I was 22. Henry was 24. I wore a simple white dress Mama made, carried a bouquet of daisies, and promised to love, honor, and obey until death did us part. I meant every word. I had no idea I was promising to obey a man who would nearly make that death come far sooner than it should have. The first few months weren't bad. We rented a small apartment in Independence, just east of Kansas City proper. Henry worked long hours, trying to prove himself to his boss, dreaming of that contracting business he wanted to start. I kept working at Woolworth's, now managing the cosmetics counter, bringing home a modest paycheck that helped pay the bills. We were young and in love and building a life, or so I thought. The first time Henry raised his voice to me, I was so shocked I actually laughed. We'd been married maybe 4 months. I'd stopped at the grocery store after work without telling him, and dinner wasn't ready when he got home. He stood in the kitchen doorway, still in his work clothes, and yelled about how he'd been working all day, and the least I could do was have a hot meal waiting. I apologized, confused by his anger, but willing to smooth things over. "I'll make something quick," I said. "It'll just take 20 minutes." He didn't hit me that time. He just stormed out, slamming the door so hard a picture fell off the wall. When he came back 2 hours later, smelling of beer, he was apologetic. Said he'd had a bad day at work, his boss had chewed him out over nothing. He'd taken it out on me, and he was sorry. So sorry. I forgave him. Of course I did. Everyone has bad days. Everyone says things they don't mean when they're stressed. That's what I told myself. The second time, he did hit me. It happened in March of 1976, 3 months before our first baby was born. I was 7 months pregnant, so swollen and uncomfortable, I could barely tie my own shoes. Henry had been drinking more lately, always with good excuses, celebrating a job well done, commiserating over one that went wrong, unwinding after a long week. I'd started to worry, but didn't know how to bring it up without starting a fight. That night, I'd made pot roast for dinner, one of Henry's favorites. But I'd overcooked it, distracted by the baby kicking and a phone call from Mama checking on me. When Henry cut into the meat and found it dry and tough, his face darkened in a way I was beginning to recognize. "You can't even cook a simple roast right anymore," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What good are you?" "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I'll make something else. There's sandwich meat." "I don't want sandwich meat. I worked 10 hours today, 10 hours of hard physical labor, and I come home to this?" He picked up his plate and threw it against the wall, where it shattered, sending pot roast and potatoes sliding down the yellow wallpaper I'd hung so carefully the month before. I stood up, hands instinctively going to my swollen belly. "Henry, please." That's when he hit me, an open-handed slap across my face that sent me stumbling backward against the counter. The shock of it was worse than the pain, though my cheek burned and my eyes watered. We'd been arguing more, yes, but he'd never actually hit me. For a moment, we both just stood there, frozen. Then Henry's face crumpled and he started crying, dropping to his knees in front of me, wrapping his arms around my legs. "Oh, God, Linda, I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I would never. I love you so much. You and the baby, you're everything to me. Please forgive me. Please." I should have left right then. I should have called Mama or gone to Patricia's or packed a bag and walked out into the night. But I was 7 months pregnant, financially dependent on a man who'd just shown me exactly who he could become, and terrified of admitting I'd made a terrible mistake. So instead, I forgave him. Again. Our daughter, Jennifer Lynn Baker, was born on June 15, 1966, at Research Medical Center. She was beautiful and perfect, with a full head of dark hair and tiny fists that gripped my finger like she'd never let go. Henry was gentle and loving in those first weeks, bringing me flowers, helping with late-night feedings, telling me I was the most amazing mother he'd ever seen. I convinced myself the violence had been an aberration, pregnancy stress, something we'd moved past. I was wrong, but it would take me years to fully accept that. Life settled into a new rhythm. I quit my job at Woolworths to stay home with Jenny. Henry got promoted to journeyman electrician, which meant more money, but also more stress and more overtime. We moved to a slightly larger apartment in Raytown, a suburb southeast of Kansas City, where the rent was cheaper and there was a small playground across the street. I joined a play group with other young mothers, women who seemed to have their lives together in ways I didn't, women whose husbands didn't leave sad, bruises hidden under long sleeves. Because Henry hit me again and again. Not constantly, sometimes months would pass without incident, but there was always another time, always another reason. Dinner was late or too cold or not what he wanted. The apartment was messy, or the baby was crying, or I'd spent too much at the grocery store. I'd talked to a male neighbor, or smiled at the mailman, or worn a dress Henry thought was too revealing. The reasons changed, but the pattern didn't. I learned to read his moods, to anticipate his anger, to walk on eggshells through my own life. I learned which topics to avoid, which tone of voice to use, how to deflect and apologize and smooth things over before they escalated. I became an expert in making myself small, in disappearing into the background of my own existence. When our son, Michael Robert Baker, was born in August of 1979, I hoped again that things would change. We were a complete family now, a daughter and a son, exactly what Henry had said he wanted. And for a while, he was better, gentler, almost like the man I'd married. But alcohol was becoming more than just a recreational habit for Henry. He drank after work, on weekends, anytime something stressed him out or made him angry. And when he drank, he got angry, mean. Not always physically violent. Sometimes the emotional abuse was worse than the hits. He'd tell me I was stupid, worthless, lucky he'd married me because no one else would want damaged goods. He'd mock my old dreams of college and teaching. "Teacher," he'd laugh, "you can barely manage 2 kids in a house. You think anyone would let you near their children?" The isolation was deliberate, though I didn't recognize it at the time. We rarely saw my family anymore. Henry always had an excuse for why we couldn't make it to Sunday dinner or holiday gatherings. When Mama called, he'd hover nearby, making it clear he was listening to every word. The friends I'd made at the playgroup slowly drifted away as I canceled plans and made excuses. I was 26 years old with 2 small children, no job, no car of my own, and no one I could tell the truth to. The physical abuse escalated slowly. A shove here, a slap there, always with apologies afterward. Sometimes he'd cry and beg forgiveness. Other times he'd buy me gifts, flowers, perfume, a new dress. as if material things could erase the sarcastic fear growing in my chest. The worst incidents left bruises I couldn't explain away, so I stopped wearing short sleeves, even in summer. I became an expert at makeup application, covering black eyes and split lips, explaining away the occasional visible mark as clumsiness or childhood injuries from the kids. Jenny was 7 and Michael was 4, the first time they witnessed their father hit me. We were in the kitchen. It was always the kitchen for some reason. As if violence belonged in the same space as family meals. And Henry was angry about something I've long since forgotten. Maybe I'd bought the wrong brand of coffee, or the mortgage payment was late, or he'd had a bad day at work. The specifics blur together after a while. What I remember clearly is him grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise, pulling me toward him while he yelled, and then backhanding me across the face so hard I tasted blood. What I remember even more clearly is the sound of fearful screaming. She ran between us, this tiny 7-year-old girl in pink pajamas with her hair in braids, putting herself between her father and her mother. "Don't hurt my mommy," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Don't hurt her." Henry stopped immediately, looking at his daughter like he was seeing her for the first time. For a moment, I thought maybe this would be the thing that changed him. The wake-up call that made him realize what he was doing to all of us. Instead, he turned and walked out, came home 3 hours later drunk and remorseful, and the cycle continued. But something had shifted that night. Jenny had seen the truth, and I couldn't pretend anymore that my children were protected from their father's violence. Michael was too young to fully understand, but Jenny knew. I could see it in the way she watched Henry, wary and frightened, jumping at sudden movements. I could see it in the way she started checking on me constantly, asking if I was okay, trying to take care of me when I was supposed to be taking care of her. The years between 1983 and 1990 blur together in my memory, a haze of fear and survival and desperate hope that things would get better. Henry's drinking got worse. His violence became more unpredictable. The good days, the days when he was loving and gentle and almost like the man I'd married, became fewer and farther between, which made me cling to them even harder when they came. I thought about leaving. God, how I thought about it. Late at night, lying awake next to a man who might wake up angry, I'd planned it out in my head. I'd take the kids and go to Mama's, or I'd call a shelter I'd seen advertised on a poster at the grocery store, or I'd save money from the grocery budget, little by little, until I had enough for first and last month's rent somewhere far away from Kansas City. But fear always stopped me. Henry controlled all the money. I had to show him receipts for every penny I spent. He'd isolated me from most of my friends and made family visits difficult. I had no job skills, no recent work history, no way to support 2 children on my own. And he'd made it clear, in ways both explicit and implied, that if I tried to leave, he'd find me, that no court would take his children away, that I'd regret it if I even thought about running. So I stayed. I stayed through Jenny's elementary school years and into middle school. I stayed through Michael's childhood. I stayed through holidays and birthdays and ordinary Tuesdays. I stayed through black eyes and broken ribs, and once, terrifyingly, a concussion that left me dizzy for days, but that I couldn't go to the hospital for, because how would I explain it? I stayed because staying felt safer than leaving, and because after enough years, I'd stopped believing I deserved better. I stayed because Henry had convinced me, slowly and systematically over nearly 2 decades, that I was nothing without him, that I was lucky he put up with me, that this was just what marriage looked like, what love looked like, and my expectations of anything different were naive and childish. I stayed until I almost forgot the girl I'd been at 21, the one who read Tolstoy and dreamed of teaching and believed the world was full of possibility. That girl felt like someone I'd made up, a character in a book I'd once read. The woman I'd become was tired and frightened and small, living in the spaces between her husband's rages, trying desperately to keep her children safe while sacrificing herself piece by piece. But here's what I didn't know in those dark years. I wasn't as broken as I felt. The girl who dreamed big dreams wasn't completely gone. She was just buried, waiting, gathering strength for the moment when survival would finally demand that she surface. That moment was coming, though I didn't know it yet. It would arrive on a frozen February night in 1998 when my children were 21 and 18. When I was 45 years old and had been married to Henry Baker for almost 23 years. It would arrive with sirens and blood and fear so sharp it cut through decades of numbness. It would arrive and change everything, including me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before I tell you about that night, the night that would become the dividing line between the life I'd endured and the life I'd chosen, I need to tell you about the warning signs I'd missed, the escalating violence I'd normalized, and the hopeful rebellions that had started to flicker inside me despite my best efforts to extinguish them. The 90s were supposed to be different. Jenny had graduated high school in 1994 and started attending the same community college where I'd once had dreams. Michael was in his mid-teens, tall and athletic, doing well in school despite the chaos at home. Henry's business, he'd finally started his own electrical contracting company in 1988, was successful enough that we'd moved into an actual house in Blue Springs, a modest 3-bedroom ranch with a small yard and neighbors on either side. From the outside, we looked successful, middle class, normal. Henry drove a nice truck with his business name painted on the side. I kept the house clean and the yard neat. The kids were good students. We looked like any other American family in suburban Kansas City, pursuing the ordinary dream of stability and comfort. But inside our house, the violence had reached levels I'd once believed impossible. Henry's drinking was now daily, starting in the afternoon and continuing until he passed out each night. The business stress, employees who quit, clients who didn't pay, competition from larger companies gave him endless excuses for his behavior. And I'd become so skilled at hiding the evidence, making excuses, and protecting the fantasy of normalcy that even my own children didn't realize how bad things had gotten. Or maybe they did know, and we were all just pretending together. The first real warning sign that things were about to reach a breaking point came in the fall of 1995. Jenny had transferred to UMKC, the university I'd once dreamed of attending, and was living in a dorm downtown, finally escaping the house she'd grown up in. Michael was 16, getting his driver's license, talking about college and football scholarships. They were both creating lives separate from us, from Henry's violence and my compliance, and I was hopeful for them, even as their leaving made me feel more alone than ever. That October evening, Henry came home angrier than I'd seen him in months. A client had refused to pay a large invoice, threatening to sue over work Henry insisted was perfect. He'd been drinking since noon. I could tell from the way he stumbled coming through the door, and was spoiling for a fight. I tried to diffuse the situation, keeping my voice calm and neutral, offering to make his favorite dinner, suggesting he sit down and relax. But nothing I said helped. He paced through the kitchen, ranting about ungrateful clients and people who didn't respect him, his voice getting louder and meaner with each passing minute. Michael was in his room doing homework. I remember being fearful for that, hoping he'd stay there, stay safe, not get involved. But teenage boys don't always think strategically when their mothers are in danger. When Henry grabbed my arm and started yelling directly in my face, I could smell the whiskey on his breath, see the rage in his eyes. I'd seen this look before and knew what was coming. I braced myself, tried to pull away without being obvious about it. Started the internal calculation of how to minimize the damage. Then Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, 6 feet tall now and athletic from football practice, looking more like a man than the little boy I still saw when I looked at him. "Leave her alone, Dad." Everything stopped. Henry turned slowly, his hand still gripping my arm hard enough to leave marks. "What did you say to me, boy?" I said, "Leave her alone." Michael's voice shook but held steady. "I'm tired of you hitting her. I'm tired of all of us being scared all the time." The next few minutes were fearful. Henry let go of me and went for Michael instead. My son held his ground, didn't fight back but didn't run either, just stood there taking his father's rage. I screamed, pulled at Henry's arms, begged him to stop. Somehow, I still don't know quite how, Michael and I both survived that night with only bruises. Henry eventually exhausted himself, collapsed on the couch, and passed out. Michael and I sat together in the kitchen long after Henry's snores filled the house. My son had a split lip and a bruise forming on his jaw. I had fingerprint marks on both arms and a ringing in my ears that wouldn't stop. "We should leave," Michael said quietly. "Mom, we should just leave, tonight, right now." I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. But fear held me frozen. Where would we go? He'd find us. And Jenny, what about your sister's college? He pays for that. If we leave, he'll stop paying, and she'll have to drop out. "So we stay because of money?" Michael's voice was bitter. "Mom, he's going to kill you one of these days. You know that, right?" I did know it. I'd known it for years, but had never said it out loud, as if not naming the fear would keep it from coming true. Hearing my teenage son say it made it real in a way I couldn't pretend away. "I'll think about it," I told him, which was what I always said. "Let me figure something out." But I didn't figure anything out. The next morning, Henry was apologetic and hungover, swearing he'd cut back on drinking, promising to be better. And because I'd been trained by decades of this cycle, I accepted his promises and stayed. The second warning sign came in the spring of 1996. I'd started volunteering at the Blue Springs Public Library, a hopeful rebellion that had taken me months to work up the courage to attempt. Henry didn't like me leaving the house except for necessary errands, but I'd framed it as charitable work, good for his business image, and he'd grudgingly agreed as long as I was home before he got off work. Those few hours a week in the library were the happy first time in years I'd felt like myself. I helped patrons find books, shelved returns, occasionally got to recommend my favorites to interested readers. It was small and insignificant to anyone else, but to me, it was hopeful. I was Linda again, not just Henry's wife or the kid's mother. I was a person with thoughts and interests beyond maintaining peace in a war zone. One of the other volunteers, a woman named Susan who was maybe 10 years older than me, noticed the bruises I tried to hide. She didn't say anything directly at first, just made sure I knew she saw them, that she understood what they meant. Then one afternoon, as we were shelving books in the reference section where no one else could hear, she said quietly, "I used to have bruises like that too." I froze, my hands gripping a volume of the Encyclopedia Britannica so hard my knuckles went white. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I was married to a man who hurt me for 15 years, and I stayed because I thought I had to, because I thought I deserved it, because I was afraid of what would happen if I left." "What changed?" I whispered. "He put me in the hospital, broke 3 of my ribs, and gave me a concussion. And when I woke up, my daughter was sitting next to my bed crying, and I realized I was teaching her that this was normal, that this was what serious love looked like. So I left, got a restraining order, filed for divorce, moved into a women's shelter for 3 months until I could afford my own place." "Was it worth it?" I asked. "All that struggle, being alone, starting over?" Susan smiled. And it was the happy, most genuine smile I'd seen in years. "Linda, I've been divorced for 8 years now. I have a small apartment, a used car, and a job that barely pays the bills. And I've never been happier in my entire life. Because I'm free. I'm finally free." She gave me the number for a domestic violence hotline written on a slip of paper tucked into a bookmark. "Just in case," she said. "When you're ready." I kept that piece of paper hidden in my purse for 2 years, too afraid to call it, but unable to throw it away. It was a tiny seed of possibility, proof that escape was achievable, that other women had done what felt impossible to me. The third warning sign came in December of 1997. Michael had graduated high school that spring and was attending Kansas State University on a partial football scholarship. Jenny was in her senior year at UMKC, planning to graduate with a degree in social work. Both my children were building lives far from home, and I was proud of them, even as their absence left me alone with Henry's violence more than ever before. That Christmas, Jenny came home with her boyfriend, a kind young man named David, whom she'd been dating for 6 months. She was happy with happiness, already talking about post-graduation plans and maybe moving in together. Henry hated David on sight, hated that some other man was important to his daughter, hated that Jenny's attention was focused elsewhere, hated that he was losing control of yet another family member. On Christmas Eve, after David had gone home and Jenny had gone to bed, Henry and I had one of the worst fights of our marriage. He'd been drinking heavily all evening, getting meaner with each beer, making disgusting comments about Jenny and David that made my skin crawl. When I finally objected, telling him to leave our daughter alone, he exploded. He pushed me against the wall so hard my head bounced off the plaster. He wrapped his hand around my throat and squeezed, cutting off my air, his face inches from mine. You think you can tell me what to do in my own house? He hissed. You think you're something special? You're nothing, Linda. You've always been nothing. He let go just before I blacked out. I slid down the wall, gasping for air, my throat burning and my heart racing so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Henry stood over me, breathing hard, his fists clenched, and for the first time in our entire marriage, I saw actual murder in his eyes. He didn't apologize that time. He just turned and walked to the bedroom, leaving me crumpled on the floor beside the Christmas tree we decorated together. Lights twinkling cheerfully on a scene of quiet horror. I sat there for hours, my hand touching the bruises already forming on my throat, and thought about Susan's words, thought about the hotline number still hidden in my purse, thought about my children, both adults now, both building hopeful, good lives that they deserved. Thought about the girl I'd been at 21, the one who'd wanted to teach and make a difference and be somebody. And I thought, for the first time with real clarity, I don't want to die in this house. The months between that Christmas Eve and the night we finally fled were a study in deteriorating control. January 1998 was brutally cold in Kansas City, the kind of cold that makes your bones ache and your breath freeze in clouds that hang in the air. The house felt even colder, filled with a tension so thick you could choke on it. Henry knew something had shifted. I could see it in the way he watched me, suspicious and calculating, as if he could sense my mental escape plans even when I tried to hide them. He'd come home from work at random times, checking to make sure I was there, that I hadn't gone anywhere or talked to anyone. He went through my purse one night while I was in the shower, though he didn't find anything. I'd memorized the hotline number and destroyed the paper weeks earlier, paranoid that he'd discover it. The violence increased in both frequency and severity. Small infractions that once would have earned a slap or a shove now resulted in serious injuries. A broken dish became a reason to throw me against the refrigerator. Dinner 5 minutes late meant being grabbed by the hair and dragged across the kitchen floor. A phone call from Jenny that lasted too long resulted in Henry smashing the phone against the wall and then backhanding me so hard I saw stars. I started documenting everything. Not physically, I was too afraid he'd find written evidence, but mentally, keeping a detailed catalog of dates and injuries in my head. January 8th, bruised ribs from being shoved into the counter. January 14th, black eye from being punched while making breakfast. January 22nd, split lip and loosened tooth from being slapped during an argument about money. January 29th, sprained wrist from being twisted behind my back when I tried to defend myself. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. I'd developed a high tolerance for that over the years. The worst part was the psychological warfare. The way Henry seemed determined to break me completely before I could even think about leaving. He told me constantly that I was worthless, stupid, ugly, that no one would believe me if I claimed he was abusive because everyone knew what a successful businessman he was, what a good provider, that my own children would choose him over me if I forced them to pick sides, that I'd end up fearful and alone, probably dead in a ditch somewhere if I was dumb enough to leave. Some days I believed him, most days actually. The voice in my head that whispered about escape was often drowned out by the louder voice that said I deserved this, that I'd brought it on myself, that I was too old and too broken to start over now. But something stubborn had taken root in me that Christmas Eve when Henry's hand closed around my throat. A tiny, fierce voice that said, "Not like this. You're not going to die like this." I started making small preparations. So subtle, even I barely acknowledged what I was doing. I hid $20 from the grocery money, tucked into an old tampon box in the bathroom that Henry would never look in. I made mental notes of which documents were where: birth certificates in the file cabinet, social security cards, and Henry's desk drawer. I paid attention to bus schedules and shelter locations, information I picked up casually, as if by accident. I called the hotline once from a payphone at the grocery store while Henry thought I was shopping. My hands shook so badly I could barely dial. The woman who answered had a kind voice, patient and understanding. She didn't push me to leave immediately or judge me for staying as long as I had. She just listened, told me I wasn't alone, explained what resources were available when I was ready. "Do you have a safety plan?" she asked, "a way to get out quickly if things escalate?" I didn't. I had vague ideas and desperate hopes, but no actual plan. She walked me through the basics: important documents, money, medications, if any, a safe place to go, a time when he'd be predictable, absent, or asleep. She gave me the address of the nearest shelter and told me they had space, that they wouldn't turn me away, that I didn't have to live like this. I hung up feeling both hopeful and terrified, because making a safety plan meant acknowledging that I might actually leave, and acknowledging I might leave meant acknowledging how fearful that would be, how many ways it could go wrong, how easily Henry could make good on his threats to find me. The first week of February, Jenny came home for a weekend visit, ostensibly to do laundry and raid our refrigerator like college students do. But I think she really came because she sensed something was wrong. My daughter had always been perceptive, even as a little girl. And she'd inherited my instinct for reading danger in her father's moods. We were alone in the kitchen Saturday morning, Henry out on a job, and Jenny was looking at me with concern that made my heart break. "Mom, you have bruises on your neck, like fingerprints." I instinctively touched my throat, where the marks from Christmas Eve had faded but not completely disappeared. "I'm fine, sweetheart, just clumsy." "Don't!" Jenny's voice was sharp. "Don't do that. Don't lie to me like I'm still a kid who doesn't know what's happening in this house. I've known what's happening since I was 7 years old, remember? When I tried to stop him from hitting you and you told me it was fine, everything was fine, just go back to bed?" Tears welled in my eyes. "Jenny, is it getting worse?" she asked. "Because it seems worse. You look scared all the time now. And you're so thin, Mom. Are you even eating?" I wasn't. Not really. Fear and stress had killed my appetite. And besides, Henry complained if I spent too much on groceries, and I was trying to hide money, and it was just easier to skip meals and say I'd eaten earlier. "I'm handling it," I said weakly. Jenny grabbed my hands, forced me to look at her. "You don't have to handle it. You can leave. I'm graduated in 4 months. I'll get a job, help support you. Michael's in college on scholarship. We don't need Dad's money anymore, Mom. We just need you to be safe." "It's not that simple." "Yes, it is. It really is. You pack a bag, you walk out the door, you don't come back. That's it. That's all you have to do." "But she was young and didn't understand how complicated leaving really was after 23 years of marriage, of dependence, of systematic destruction of your own sense of self-worth. She didn't understand that the most dangerous time in an abusive relationship is when you try to leave, that women are most likely to be killed during separation, that Henry's threats weren't empty. Still, her words planted something deeper than the hotline conversation had. My daughter believed I could do this. My daughter was willing to sacrifice her own stability to help me escape. My daughter, whom I tried so hard to protect from the truth, had been carrying her own burden of knowledge all these years and was finally strong enough to tell me to save myself. After Jenny left Sunday evening, after Henry came home and we went through the motions of a normal evening, dinner, television, separate silences, I lay awake planning. Not vaguely hoping anymore, but actually planning. I would wait until Henry was asleep, drunk enough not to wake easily. I would take only what I could carry, move quietly, leave no note. I would go to the shelter the hotline woman had mentioned, the one with the address I'd memorized. I would take the first step and then the next and then the next until I was far enough away that turning back became impossible. I didn't know when it would happen, just that it would. Soon. You know, I can tell this is a heavy story, and if you're still with me right now, I appreciate it more than I can say. These memories aren't easy to share, but they matter. If you're finding something hopeful in this, whether it's hope or validation or just knowing you're not alone, would you take just a second to hit that like button? And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What would you do in this situation? How would you find the courage? Your engagement helps this story reach other women who might need to hear it, and that matters so much. The night everything came to a head was February 18th, 1998. A Wednesday. The kind of day that starts ordinary and ends in ways that split your life into before and after. Henry had been drinking since he got home from work at 4 o'clock. By 8, he was angry drunk, the kind where every word out of his mouth was an insult or accusation. By 9, he was pacing, looking for a fight, and I was doing everything I could to avoid giving him one. Michael had come home from college for a long weekend, planning to leave Thursday morning. He was in his room with his door closed, music playing, trying to ignore the tension that filled the house like smoke. I wished he'd stayed at school. Whatever was coming, I didn't want him here for it. The trigger was something insignificant. I don't even remember what. Maybe I said something Henry didn't like or looked at him wrong or failed to respond quickly enough to some demand. It doesn't matter. With Henry, the trigger was never really the trigger. The trigger was just an excuse for violence he was going to commit anyway. What I remember clearly is his hand fisting in my hair, dragging me from the kitchen into the living room. I remember stumbling, crying out in pain, trying to get my balance but unable to because he was moving too fast. I remember him throwing me against the wall with enough force that a framed family photo fell and shattered, glass scattering across the carpet. "You stupid bitch," he was saying, his voice thick with alcohol and rage. "You think you're something? You think you matter? I should have left you years ago, but who else would have taken you?" He hit me then, a closed fist punch to my ribs that drove the air from my lungs. I crumpled, gasping, trying to breathe through the pain. He stood over me, and I could see in his eyes that he wasn't stopping this time. that something in him had snapped, some last restraint had broken, and he was going to hurt me worse than he ever had before. That's when, surprised, Michael's door opened. My son stood in the hallway, looking at his father standing over his mother, and something terrible and final crossed his face. He'd gotten bigger in the months since starting college, heavier with muscle from the weight room, and he moved toward Henry with purpose. "Get away from her," Michael said, his voice deadly calm. "This is between me and your mother, boy. Go back to your room." "I'm not a boy anymore, and I'm not going anywhere. Get away from her." Henry turned fully toward Michael then, and I saw what was going to happen a second before it did. Saw Henry's fist draw back, saw him lunge at his own son. Saw Michael brace himself for impact. But Michael was younger and faster and sober, and he caught Henry's arm before the punch could land. For a moment, they just stood there, frozen in a grotesque tableau of father and son locked in combat. Then Henry stumbled backward, off-balanced from alcohol and rage, and fell hard against the coffee table, which collapsed under his weight. The sound of splintering seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Henry lay there in the wreckage of the coffee table, bleeding from a cut on his forehead where he'd hit the edge, stunned and dazed. Michael was breathing hard, his fists still clenched, looking at his father with an expression I couldn't quite read. Anger and fear and something like grief, all mixed together. "Mom," Michael said, not taking his eyes off Henry, "pack a bag, right now. We're leaving." "Michael, we can't." "Right now, Mom. We're not doing this anymore. We're not spending one more night in this house." Henry was starting to sit up, touching his bleeding forehead, his expression transitioning from shock to a fearful rage more dangerous than anything I'd seen before. "You little shit," he slurred. "You dare put your hands on me in my own house?" "It's not your house anymore," Michael said. "It's a place where you beat your wife and terrorize your family, and we're done." I don't know where I found the strength to move, but something in Michael's voice bypassed all my fear and indecision. I scrambled to my feet, ribs screaming with pain, and ran to the bedroom. My hands shook so badly I could barely grip anything, but I grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and started throwing things in it: clothes, my mother's jewelry, the hidden money from the bathroom, anything I could grab in the desperate 30 seconds of frantic packing. Behind me, I could hear Henry yelling, Michael's calm voice responding, furniture scraping across floors. Every second felt like an hour. Every moment I expected Henry to appear in the doorway, to stop me, to make good on his threats about what would happen if I ever tried to leave. I grabbed the file box from the closet where I knew the important documents were: birth certificates, social security cards, marriage license. Shoved it under my arm along with the duffel bag. Took one last look at the bedroom where I'd slept next to my abuser for 23 years and felt nothing but desperate urgency to never see it again. When I came back to the living room, Michael had positioned himself between Henry and the front door. My son looked at me, saw that I was ready, and nodded. "Let's go." "You walk out that door?" "You don't come back," Henry said, his voice venomous. "Either of you. You're dead to me. And Linda, you think you're going to make it on your own? You've got nothing. No job, no money, no skills. You'll be back here begging within a week." "Then I guess you'll be disappointed," I said, and was shocked by the steadiness in my own voice. because I'd rather be homeless than spend one more day with you." We walked out the front door into the frozen February night, leaving behind everything we couldn't carry: furniture and photos and 23 years of accumulated life. We walked out and didn't look back, even though I could hear Henley yelling behind us, could hear things breaking as he destroyed what remained. Michael's car was in the driveway, but his hands were shaking too hard to get the key in the lock. I gently took the keys from him, unlocked the doors, threw our bags in the back. We sat there for a moment in the dark car, engine not yet started, both of us breathing hard, neither quite believing what we'd just done. "Where do we go?" Michael asked quietly. I told him the address of the shelter, the one I'd memorized months ago. He started the car, and we pulled out of the driveway as lights turned on in neighbors' houses, drawn by the noise of Henry's rage. We drove through the quiet streets of Blue Springs, past houses where normal families were settling in for normal evenings, and I felt like I was watching my old life recede in the rearview mirror. We didn't talk during the drive. What was there to say? We'd just blown up our entire lives in the span of 15 minutes. We'd just chosen the terrifying unknown over the familiar horror. We'd just done what I'd been too afraid to do for over 2 decades. The shelter was in downtown Kansas City, in an unmarked building that looked like it could be offices or apartments or anything else. That was the point: to be unremarkable, to be safe, to be somewhere abusers couldn't easily find their victims. Michael parked on the street, and we sat there for a long moment, both of us staring at the building that represented salvation or another kind of trap, depending on how you looked at it. "You okay?" Michael asked. I wasn't. I was in pain from Henry's punch, my ribs possibly cracked. I was fearful of what came next, of whether Henry would find us, of how we'd survive. I was grieving the life I'd tried so hard to build, even though that life had been killing me slowly. I was 45 years old, with no job, no money beyond the few $100s I'd hidden, no idea what tomorrow would look like. But I was also free for the first time in 23 years. Sitting in that car outside that shelter, I was happy. "Yeah," I told my son, "I'm okay. Let's go inside." The woman who answered the door at the shelter was maybe 60, with gray hair pulled back in a bun and eyes that had seen everything and judged none of it. She took in my bruises, Michael's protective stance, our meager bags, and simply stepped aside to let us in. "I'm Dorothy," she said, and I nearly cried at hearing my mother's name. "You're safe here. Let's get you settled." The next hours were a blur of kindness. Dorothy showed us to a small room with 2 twin beds, clean white sheets, and bars on the window that should have felt like a cage, but instead felt like protection. She brought ice for my ribs, offered to take us to the emergency room for x-rays, gave Michael numbers for counseling services and legal aid. She asked no questions about what brought us there, made no judgments about why it took so long, just practical help and quiet dignity. Other women emerged from rooms down the hall, ranging in age from early 20s to a woman I later learned was 67. They nodded at us with understanding that needed no words. We were all members of the same terrible club, survivors of a violence that often remained invisible until it nearly killed us. That first night in the shelter, I lay awake listening to Michael's breathing from the bed across the room, the unfamiliar sounds of the building settling around us, and thought about the path that had led me there. 23 years of marriage, 2 decades of escalating violence, years of believing I had no choice, no options, no value beyond what Henry allowed me to have. And I thought about Susan from the library who told me about her own escape 8 years earlier. About the hotline counselor who talked me through a safety plan. About Jenny who told me I was worth saving. About Michael who'd physically stood between me and death tonight. About all the hopeful, small moments of kindness and courage that had built up like tiny stones until they formed a bridge I could finally walk across. I thought, too, about all the versions of myself I'd been. The ambitious girl at 21, the young mother trying to hold her family together, the middle-aged woman who'd forgotten she deserved to exist without fear. None of those versions were gone, I realized. They were all still here, carried inside me, waiting to be remembered and reclaimed. But first, I had to figure out how to, desperate, survive the immediate future, how to get a restraining order before Henry found us, how to file for divorce without money for a lawyer, how to find a job after 20 years out of the workforce. How to rebuild a life from absolutely nothing. The planning started that very first night, lying in that narrow shelter bed with my ribs aching and my future terrifying and uncertain. But for the first time in decades, the future was mine to plan, mine to shape, mine to survive or fail at on my own terms. And that made all the difference. Listen, I know this part of the story is intense. We just walked through the hardest moment, the escape, the violence, the decision that changed everything. And if you made it this far, I want you to know something. That moment I just described, that's the moment everything became possible. Before I tell you what happened next, I need to ask, did this resonate with you? Did it make you think or feel something? If it did, please take a second to hit that like button if you haven't already, and leave a comment telling me what you thought. Your words and support don't just help this channel, they create a community of people who understand that these stories matter, that survival matters, that we're stronger than we know. Thank you for being here. The morning after we escaped, I woke up disoriented, forgetting for a moment where I was. Then reality crashed back. The shelter, Henry, the bridge we'd burned. My ribs ached with every breath, a sharp reminder that this wasn't a dream or a nightmare I could wake up from. This was real life, and it was just beginning. Dorothy knocked softly on our door at 7, bringing coffee and cinnamon rolls from a local bakery that donated to the shelter. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her eyes taking in my bruised face, the way I moved carefully to protect my injured ribs. "Like I've been hit by a truck," I said honestly, "but alive." "That's a start." She sat on the edge of Michael's bed. He'd already gone down the hall to shower and pulled out a yellow legal pad covered in notes. "We need to move quickly. Your husband will probably start looking for you today if he hasn't already. We need to get you legal protection before he finds you." She outlined a plan with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. First, we'd go to the courthouse and file for an order of protection, what used to be called a restraining order. Then, we'd meet with a legal aid lawyer about divorce proceedings. Then, we'd visit social services to apply for emergency assistance, since I had no income and no immediate prospects. Then we'd start looking at job opportunities and temporary housing options, since the shelter was only designed for short-term stays. It was overwhelming. I'd spent 23 years having every decision made for me, every movement controlled, every thought questioned. Now I had to make 100 decisions, each one potentially life-altering, and I had to make them quickly and correctly. I don't know if I can do this, I whispered. Dorothy took my hand, her grip firm and warm. Yes, you can, and you don't have to do it alone. We're going to help you through every step. All you have to do is keep saying yes. Yes to help, yes to safety, yes to yourself. Can you do that? I could. Barely, but I could. That morning, Michael and I went to the Jackson County Courthouse, imposing building downtown, where the weight of law felt both protective and intimidating. The woman at the clerk's office handed me forms to fill out, asking me to document the abuse, to write down dates and descriptions of violence. My hand shook as I wrote, memories flooding back faster than I could process them. December 24th. 1997, choked until nearly unconscious. January 14, 1998, punched in face, resulting in black eye. February 18, 1998, punched in ribs, thrown against wall, threatened with further violence. The words looked stark and terrible on the official form, stripped of all the context and excuses and rationalizations I'd built up over the years. Just facts, just violence, just the truth I'd been hiding from everyone, including myself. The judge who reviewed my petition was a woman maybe 10 years older than me, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She read through my statement, looked at the visible bruises on my face and neck, and granted the temporary order of protection immediately. Henry would be served with papers within 48 hours, legally prohibited from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of me or the shelter. This is a temporary order, she explained. You'll need to come back in 2 weeks for a hearing to make it permanent. Your husband will have the right to contest it. Do you have a lawyer? I couldn't afford one. The judge wrote down the name and number of a legal aid organization, told me to call them immediately, and wished me luck with genuine sympathy in her eyes. We left the courthouse with a piece of paper that was supposed to keep me safe, though I knew better than to put too much faith in it. Orders of protection work for men who care about legal consequences. Henry had already shown he cared more about control than consequences. The next stop was the legal aid office, where a young attorney named Maria took my case. She was maybe 30, with confident, fierce intelligence and a passion for helping women that reminded me of my daughter. Over the next 2 hours, she walked me through the process of filing for divorce, explaining Missouri's laws about property division and spousal support. You were married 23 years, Maria said. You're entitled to a portion of marital assets, including the house and his business. We'll also request temporary maintenance while the divorce is pending, since you have no current income. He's going to fight this, I said. Every step. He's going to make this as painful as possible. Probably, Maria agreed. But that's what I'm here for, to fight back, to make sure you get what you're legally entitled to, regardless of what he wants. And Linda, you're stronger than you think. You got out. That's the hardest part. Everything else is just paperwork and waiting. It didn't feel like just paperwork. It felt like dismantling a life, piece by piece, form by form. But I signed everything she put in front of me, answered every question, provided every piece of information I could remember about our finances and assets and the accumulated detritus of 2 decades of marriage. By the time we left the legal aid office, it was afternoon, and I was exhausted in ways that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Michael had been with me through all of it, my quiet, steady support, and I could see the strain on his young face. He'd given up his spring break for this, was missing classes and football practice to help his mother escape his father. The guilt of that threatened to swallow me whole. "You should go back to school," I told him as we sat in a small cafe near the shelter, picking at sandwiches neither of us had much appetite for. "You've done so much, but you need to get back to your life." "My life includes making sure you're okay," Michael said firmly. "I'm not leaving until I know you're settled, until I know he can't get to you." I wanted to argue, to tell him I could handle it myself, to release him from the burden of his mother's choices. But the truth was, I needed him. I needed his strength and his presence and his unwavering certainty that we'd done the right thing. So I just nodded and squeezed his hand across the table, grateful, grateful beyond words. The weeks that followed were a serious crash course in rebuilding a life from nothing. I applied for temporary assistance through the Missouri Department of Social Services, swallowing my pride to accept food stamps and emergency cash aid. I registered with temp agencies, hoping my ancient secretarial skills from before I married Henry might be enough to get me hired somewhere. I attended support groups at the shelter, listening to other women's stories, finding hopeful strength in our shared experiences. Dorothy became my grateful lifeline during those early days. She'd been through her own escape decades earlier and now dedicated her retirement to helping other women do the same. She taught me practical things, how to open a bank account in my own name, how to get a post office box so Henry couldn't track my mail, how to change my emergency contacts and beneficiaries. She also taught me emotional survival, how to recognize and resist the urge to go back, how to counter the voice in my head that said I'd made a terrible mistake, how to build an identity separate from being someone's wife. "You're not Henry's wife anymore," she told me one afternoon as we sat in the shelter's common room. "You're Linda Baker, soon to be Linda Morrison again if you want. You're a woman with a history and a future, with strengths and skills, with value that exists completely independently of any man. That's going to take time to believe, but eventually you will." I wanted to believe her. Some days I almost did. Other days, the fear and doubt were overwhelming. Henry was served with the restraining order on February 20th, and according to the process server, he'd raged and threatened and had to be warned that violation of the order would result in arrest. He'd tried calling the shelter multiple times, but they screened all calls and wouldn't confirm I was there. He'd driven by slowly several times, but the building's security and the protection order kept him from doing more than that. Knowing he was looking for me, that he was angry and probably planning some kind of retaliation, made every moment feel dangerous. I jumped at sudden sounds. I scanned every room I entered for exits. I had nightmares where he found me, dragged me back, made good on his threats. The fear I'd lived with for 2 decades didn't disappear just because I'd escaped. If anything, fearful because now I knew what I had to lose. But slowly, impossibly, things started to come together. A temp agency placed me in a short-term office job at a medical supply company, filing and data entry for $9 an hour. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was proof I could work, could earn money, could begin to support myself. My coworkers were kind, asking no questions about my bruises or my situation, just showing me the systems and treating me like a competent adult. That first paycheck, $324 after taxes for 2 weeks of work, brought me to tears. I'd earned this. Me, not as someone's wife or mother, but as a worker who'd done a job and been compensated for it. The amount was laughably small compared to our living expenses, but it represented something enormous. Possibility. I opened a checking account at a small credit union, depositing that first paycheck with hands that shook with emotion. The teller, an older Black woman with kind eyes, smiled at me. First account? First account in my own name, I clarified. After 23 years of marriage. Her smile widened. Honey, that's worth celebrating. You're starting your own story now. Make it a good one. I was trying to. God, how I was trying. Jenny came to visit twice in those first few weeks, bringing food and clothes and proud pride in her mother's courage. She'd moved back home to her dorm after our escape, finishing her last semester, but she called every day to check on me. My daughter had spent so many years trying to protect me, and now she was learning that I could protect myself, that I had protected myself by leaving. That strength had been inside me all along, just buried under years of fear and conditioning. Michael went back to school after the first week, reluctant, but reassured by the shelter's security and my legal protections. He called every night, sometimes just to say hi, sometimes to talk about his fear that Henry would find me, sometimes just to breathe together over the phone line in shared understanding of what we'd survived. The hearing for the permanent protection order was scheduled for March 4th, exactly 2 weeks after the temporary order was issued. Henry had the right to appear and contest it, and Maria warned me he almost certainly would. She prepared me for what to expect. His lawyer would try to minimize the abuse, to make it seem like a mutual problem or a one-time incident blown out of proportion. They try to make me look unstable, vindictive, financially motivated. None of that matters, Maria insisted. What matters is the truth. You tell the truth about what happened. You show the judge your injuries, and the order will be granted. I've seen this 100 times. Abusers rely on their victims staying silent. Once you speak up, their power disappears. I hoped she was right, but I was terrified of seeing Henry again, even in a courtroom, even with bailiffs and lawyers in the protection of law. I was terrified he'd look at me the way he used to, like I was nothing, like I belonged to him, like leaving had been a temporary inconvenience he'd soon correct. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow shelter bed, listening to the sounds of other women's restless nights, and thought about everything that had brought me to this moment. The girl who'd dreamed of teaching, the young woman who'd fallen in love with the wrong man, the mother who'd tried desperately to protect her children while sacrificing herself, the middle-aged woman who'd finally decided she deserved to live. All those versions of me had led to this, a courtroom showdown that would determine whether I got to stay free or whether Henry's power over me would continue, enforced by law instead of violence. I had no idea which way it would go. All I knew was that I'd come too far to turn back now. That the terror of facing Henry in court was still less than the terror of spending another day as his wife. That whatever happened tomorrow, I'd survived worse and would survive this too. That thought, I'll survive this, was revolutionary. For so many years, survival had meant enduring, accepting, minimizing myself to avoid Henry's rage. Now survival meant fighting back, standing up, refusing to disappear. It meant showing up in that courtroom and telling the truth, regardless of consequences. I could do that. I would do that. I had to. Because the alternative, going back, giving up, accepting that the last 23 years were all my life would ever be, was no longer survivable. I'd tasted freedom, however terrifying and uncertain it was, and I could, hopeful, never unknow what that felt like. So I lay there in the darkness, preparing myself mentally for battle, and waited for morning to come. The morning of March 4th, 1998, dawned gray and cold, matching my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully in clothes Ginny had brought me, a simple navy dress that covered my arms, practical shoes, minimal makeup to look presentable without hiding the fading bruises on my face. Maria had advised me to let the judge see evidence of the abuse, to make it real rather than abstract. Michael had driven down from Kansas State again, insisting on being there for moral support. Ginny had skipped her morning classes. They both sat with me in the courthouse hallway, one on each side, my children flanking me like bodyguards. I drew strength from their presence, even as my stomach churned with anxiety. "He's here," Michael said quietly, nodding toward the entrance. Henry walked in with his lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. My husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, looked thinner than I remembered, his face haggard, his movements agitated. When his eyes found me across the hallway, the hatred in them was so intense, I actually flinched backward. Michael's hand tightened on my arm, steadying me. "Don't look at him," Jenny whispered. "You don't owe him anything, not even eye contact." She was right. I kept my gaze fixed on the floor, on the opposite wall, anywhere but on the man who'd controlled my life for over 2 decades. The man who'd hit me, choked me, threatened me, systematically destroyed my sense of self-worth until I'd almost forgotten I was a person separate from his anger. "Linda Baker?" A bailiff called my name. My legs felt like water as I stood. Maria appeared at my elbow, professional and confident, guiding me into the courtroom. It was smaller than I'd expected from television shows, just a judge's bench, a witness stand, a few rows of seats. But the weight of it, the official power to grant or deny my freedom, made the small space feel enormous. The judge was the same woman who'd granted the temporary order, which Maria said was a good sign. She'd already seen my initial petition, already decided there was enough evidence to justify immediate protection. Now we just had to prove it should continue. Henry's lawyer went first, painting a picture of a troubled marriage where both parties shared blame, where stress and misunderstanding had led to regrettable incidents, but nothing that justified permanent legal intervention. He suggested I was exaggerating, seeking financial advantage in the upcoming divorce, trying to punish Henry for being an imperfect but ultimately loving husband. It was disgusting fiction, and hearing my 23 years of terror recast as mutual marital discord made me feel sick. But Maria had prepared me for this. "They always do this," she'd said. "They always try to make abuse sound normal, reasonable, both-sided. That's why your testimony matters so much." When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the witness stand on legs that barely supported me. I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Then I sat and faced the judge, carefully not looking at Henry, even though I could feel his presence like a physical weight. Maria's questions were straightforward. How long had we been married? When did the abuse start? Could I describe specific incidents? How often did it happen? Had my children witnessed it? What injuries had I sustained? I answered each question as honestly as I could. My voice shaking but clear. I described the first slap when I was pregnant with Jenny, the escalating violence over the years, the time he choked me on Christmas Eve, the final night when Michael had to physically intervene to stop Henry from seriously hurting me. I described living in fearful, constant fear, walking on eggshells, believing for years that I deserved the violence or somehow caused it. "Why did you stay so long?" the judge asked, not unkindly. It was the question everyone asks, the one that carries implicit judgment. If it was so bad, why didn't you just leave? As if leaving were simple, as if fear and financial dependence and psychological manipulation weren't chains as strong as any physical restraint. I stayed because I was fearful, I said simply. Fearful he'd kill me if I left, afraid I couldn't support myself and my children, afraid of admitting my marriage was a failure. Afraid because after enough years of being told you're worthless, you start to believe it. I stayed because staying felt safer than leaving until the night it didn't anymore. Until staying meant dying, and leaving meant at least having a hopeful chance at living. The judge nodded slowly, making notes. Then she looked at Henry. "Mr. Baker, do you wish to testify?" Henry's lawyer whispered urgently to him, but Henry shook his head and stood. Against his lawyer's advice, he was going to speak. My heart rate, nervous, accelerated. This could go very badly. "Your Honor," Henry said, his voice angry with barely controlled anger, "my wife is exaggerating what happened. Yes, we had arguments. Yes, I may have raised my hand to her a couple times over 23 years when she pushed me too far. But this," he gestured at me, at the courtroom, at the entire situation. "This is vindictive. She's trying to destroy me, take my business, turn my children against me. She's not a victim. She's a woman who wants out of her marriage and is willing to lie to get what she wants." The judge's expression remained neutral, but I saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition, maybe. She'd heard this before, this minimizing, this blame shifting, this attempt to recast victim as villain. "Mr. Baker," the judge said carefully, "I have medical records here from the emergency room documenting injuries consistent with assault. I have photographs of bruising. I have testimony from your son about witnessing violence. This goes beyond a couple times over 23 years. Do you dispute these documented facts?" Henry's jaw clenched. "Those could have been accidents. She's clumsy. And my son is young, easily manipulated by his mother." "That's enough," the judge interrupted. "I've heard sufficient testimony." She looked down at her notes, then directly at me. "Mrs. Baker, I'm granting the permanent order of protection. Mr. Baker is prohibited from contacting you directly or indirectly, from coming within 500 feet of your residence or workplace, from possessing firearms, and from any form of harassment or stalking. This order is effective immediately and will remain in effect for 1 year, after which you may petition for renewal if needed. Violation of this order is a criminal offense punishable by arrest and imprisonment." Relief flooded through me so powerfully I thought I might faint. My hands gripped the arms of the witness chair, holding on while the room spun slightly. Behind me, I heard Jenny gasp and Michael exhale sharply. We'd won. The law was on my side. I had official, legal protection. Henry exploded. "This is ridiculous. She's my wife. You can't just—" "Mr. Baker, I can and I have." The judge's voice was steel. I suggest you comply fully with this order unless you want to add contempt of court to your problems. This hearing is concluded." The bailiff moved toward Henry as he continued to argue with his lawyer, his voice rising, his face red with rage. Maria quickly ushered me out of the courtroom before things could escalate further. We met Jenny and Michael in the hallway, and my daughter threw her arms around me, crying with relief. "You did it, Mom! You really did it!" I had. I'd faced Henry in a courtroom, told the truth about our marriage, and won legal protection from the man who terrorized me for over 2 decades. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of rebuilding my life, but it felt hopeful. It felt like proof that the system could work, that speaking up mattered, that I was worth protecting. But the protection order was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. I still needed to survive the divorce, find permanent housing, build a career that could actually support me. The legal victory felt good, but it didn't pay the bills or erase 23 years of trauma, or guarantee Henry wouldn't find ways to hurt me that didn't technically violate the order. Still, it was a start, a foundation I could build on. The divorce proceedings began in earnest after the protection order was granted. Maria filed all the necessary paperwork, and Henry's lawyer responded with aggressive counterclaims. Henry wanted sole ownership of the business, the house, most of our assets. He claimed I'd contributed nothing to the marriage, that I'd been supported by his hard work for 2 decades, and deserved nothing beyond minimal spousal support. It was infuriating and hurtful, this legal rewriting of our shared history. I'd raised his children, maintained his home, supported his career at the cost of my own ambitions. I'd endured his violence with no complaint for years to preserve the family structure. And now he was arguing I deserved nothing. But Maria was fierce in her advocacy. She documented my contributions as a homemaker and parent, cited Missouri law about equitable division of marital assets, demanded temporary maintenance while the divorce was pending. The legal battle stretched over months, each motion and counter-motion requiring more paperwork, more court appearances, more facing Henry across various legal settings. The temporary maintenance was granted in April, $800 a month, barely enough to live on, but combined with my temp job income, just enough to start looking for my own apartment. The shelter had been a sanctuary, but it was always meant to be temporary. I needed my own space, my own door I could lock. My own small corner of the world that was hopeful mine alone. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in Independence, not far from where we'd lived during the early years of our marriage. It was small and old, with appliances that barely worked and carpet that had seen better days. But the rent was only $400 a month, and the landlord didn't require much security deposit. And when I walked through the empty rooms, I felt something I hadn't felt in decades: hope. This was mine. This tiny, imperfect space was mine. Henry didn't have a key. Henry didn't know the address. It was protected information through the court order. Henry couldn't walk through that door and hurt me anymore. I moved in on a Saturday in May with help from both kids and Dorothy from the shelter. We carried in secondhand furniture donated by a local church, boxes of kitchen supplies and bedding, and all the mundane necessities of establishing a household. Jenny hung cheerful curtains she'd bought at Target. Michael assembled a small table and 2 chairs. Dorothy helped me organize the kitchen, showing me how to make the most of limited cabinet space. That night, after everyone had left and I was alone for the first time in my own apartment, I sat on my donated couch and cried. Not from sadness exactly, from overwhelm, from relief, from the sheer weight of everything that had happened in the past 3 months. The escape, the legal battles, the constant anxiety, the small victories and setbacks. From the realization that I'd actually done it. I'd left Henry and built the beginnings of a new life. And I was still here, still breathing, still moving forward. The temp job turned into a permanent position in June. The medical supply company offered me a full-time role as an administrative assistant with benefits and a salary of $20,000 a year. It wasn't much, barely above poverty level for a single person, but it was mine. I'd earned it through my work, my competence, my value as an employee. Every paycheck felt like validation that I was capable, that I could support myself, that I didn't need Henry's money or permission to exist in the world. I started taking GED classes at the community center, working toward eventually going back to school. My old associate degree from 1974 felt like ancient history, but maybe I could build on it. Maybe I could still become a teacher or something close to it. Maybe the dreams I'd put aside at 22 weren't completely dead, just dormant. The divorce was finalized in September of 1998, 8 months after I'd fled into that frozen night. The settlement wasn't everything Maria had fought for, but it was fair. I got half the equity in the house, which Henry had to refinance to buy me out. I got a portion of his business assets. I got maintenance for 5 years to help me get back on my feet. It wasn't wealth, but it was enough to feel secure, to pay off some debt, to save a little money for emergencies. More importantly, I got my freedom. The legal end of a marriage that had nearly killed me. The official severing of ties to a man who'd controlled my life for so long, I'd forgotten what autonomy felt like. On the day the divorce became final, I went to the courthouse alone to pick up the decree. I held the paper in my hands, official proof that I was no longer Henry Baker's wife, and felt lighter than I had in decades. I was Linda Morrison again, or I could be if I wanted. Or I could be Linda Baker still, reclaiming the name, but not the meaning behind it. Or I could be someone entirely new. I was 45 years old, divorced, living in a small apartment on a modest income, starting over from nearly nothing. By most measures, I'd failed spectacularly at the life I was supposed to have, the successful marriage, the stable family, the comfortable middle-class existence. But I was alive, I was safe, I was free. And those things felt more valuable than any measure of conventional success. The first year after the divorce was finalized was a study in learning to be myself. Simple things felt revolutionary. Going to bed when I wanted without fear of waking a drunk, angry man. Eating what I wanted for dinner without worrying if it would trigger rage. Wearing clothes because I liked them, not because they hid bruises. Making plans without asking permission, existing without constantly monitoring someone else's mood, trying to predict and prevent violence. It was glorious. It was terrifying. It was healing and disorienting in equal measure. I kept working at the medical supply company, steadily building my skills and confidence. My boss, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia who reminded me of my older sister, became something of a mentor. She taught me computer skills I'd never had reason to learn, helped me understand office politics, encouraged me to speak up in meetings when I had ideas. She treated me like my thoughts mattered, my contributions had value, my presence made a difference. One day, about a year after I'd started, Patricia pulled me into her office. Linda, I'm promoting you to office manager. You've earned it. You're reliable, you're good with people, and you understand how things work. The position comes with a raise, $28,000 a year, and more responsibility. Are you interested? Was I Interested in recognition? In advancement? In earning enough to actually feel comfortable rather than constantly stretched thin? Yes, I said, my voice steady and sure. Absolutely yes. That promotion was a hopeful turning point. Not just financially, though the extra money helped tremendously, but psychologically. Someone saw value in me, saw potential, saw worth beyond just showing up and following orders. I was being trusted with responsibility, with leadership, with making decisions that affected other people. It was the first time since I was 21 that someone had invested in my future rather than dismissing my capabilities. My relationship with my children deepened and evolved during that first year. Jenny graduated from UMKC in May of 1999 with her social work degree and immediately got a job at a nonprofit helping domestic violence survivors. She told me later that watching my journey from victim to survivor had inspired her career choice, that she wanted to help other women find the same courage I'd found. Michael finished his sophomore year at K-State and came home for the summer. He got a job at a construction company, helping me financially, even though I insisted he save for school. We'd sit in my small apartment some evenings, eating takeout Chinese food and watching television, and the absence of tension felt almost surreal. No walking on eggshells, no monitoring moods, just a happy mother and son enjoying each other's company in peaceful safety. "Are you happy, Mom?" Michael asked me one night. I thought about the question seriously. Was I happy? I was still healing from decades of trauma. I still had nightmares sometimes about Henry finding me. I still struggled with low self-esteem and the voice in my head that whispered I was worthless. I still jumped at sudden loud noises and apologized reflexively when I'd done nothing wrong. But I was also building a life I'd chosen, working a job I was good at, living in a space that was mine, making decisions about my own time, my own money, my own future. Slowly, carefully, remembering who I'd been before fear became my defining characteristic. "I'm getting there," I told my son honestly. "Some days are harder than others, but yeah, I think I'm happy. Or at least, I'm on my way to happy." That seemed to satisfy him. It satisfied me, too. Happiness wasn't a destination I'd arrive at and stay forever. It was a direction I was moving in, slowly but steadily, one day at a time. I started attending a support group for domestic violence survivors, meeting weekly with other women who understood what I'd been through without needing lengthy explanations. We shared our stories, our struggles, our small victories and setbacks. We celebrated each other's progress and held space for each other's grief. We reminded each other that we deserved better, that the abuse wasn't our fault, that hopeful healing was possible, even when it felt impossibly far away. One woman in the group, Carol, became a happy friend. She was 62, had escaped her abusive marriage 3 years earlier, and had rebuilt her life with determination and grace. She took me under her wing, showing me that survival was possible, that life could be good again, that age was no barrier to starting over. "The best years of my life started at 59, she told me once. After I left him, after I remembered I was a person, not just his property. You've got decades ahead of you, Linda. Decades to be whoever you want to be. Don't waste them looking backward." I tried to take her advice. I enrolled in night classes at the community college, working toward a degree in human services. Maybe I couldn't become a teacher like I'd once dreamed, but I could still work with people, still make a difference, still use my experience to help others. Jenny encouraged me constantly, saying she was proud to have a fellow student for a mother. I learned to manage my own finances, to budget and save and plan for the future. I learned to do home repairs instead of waiting for someone else to fix things. I learned to drive confidently instead of timidly, to speak up instead of staying silent, to take up space in the world instead of constantly apologizing for my existence. These small skills, mundane to people who'd always had autonomy, felt like revolutionary acts for someone who'd spent 2 decades being told she was incapable of managing her own life. Henry stayed out of my life after the divorce, mostly. He violated the restraining order twice in the first year, once by showing up at my apartment building and shouting threats from the parking lot, once by sending threatening letters through a third party. Both times I called the police, filed reports, had the violations documented. Both times he was arrested and released with warnings. The third time, he was told, would mean jail time. There wasn't a third time. Maybe he finally accepted that I was serious about staying away. Maybe his lawyer convinced him that further violations would hurt his business reputation. Maybe he simply moved on to terrorizing someone else. I didn't know and didn't care as long as he left me alone. I did hear through mutual acquaintances that he'd started dating someone new, a woman in her 30s who worked at a bar he frequented. Part of me felt sorry for her, wondered if I should warn her about what she was getting into. But Maria advised against any contact, even indirect. That could be construed as violating the mutual no-contact provisions of our divorce agreement. You can't save everyone, Maria told me gently. You saved yourself. That has to be enough. It had to be, though it sat uneasily with me, knowing another woman might be experiencing what I'd survived. Years passed faster than I expected. I got my associate degree in human services in 2001 at 48 years old, walking across the stage to receive my diploma with both kids cheering from the audience. I cried through the entire ceremony, mourning the girl who'd started this journey at 19 and celebrating the woman who'd finished it at 48, having survived everything in between. I got promoted again at work, this time to operations manager, with a salary that finally felt comfortable rather than constantly stretched thin. I bought my first car, a used Honda Civic that was nothing fancy, but was reliable and mine. I took my first vacation in decades, a road trip to Colorado with Carol, marveling at mountains and happy freedom in equal measure. Jenny got married in 2002 to David, the boyfriend she'd brought home that last terrible Christmas. They bought a small house in Kansas City, not far from me, and started talking about having children. The idea of becoming a grandmother filled me with happy and terror. Joy at the continuity of life, terror at the responsibility of helping raise another generation without passing on trauma. Michael graduated from K-State and got a job coaching high school football while working toward his teaching certification. He visited regularly, and we'd happy rebuilt a relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than shared survival of abuse. He told me once that he was proud of me, that watching me rebuild my life had taught him more about strength and courage than anything else could have. I started volunteering at the domestic violence shelter where I'd stayed after escaping Henry. I led support groups, helped new residents navigate legal systems and social services, shared my story when it might help someone else find hope. Dorothy had passed away in 2003, and I felt like continuing her work was a way to honor what she'd done for me. The years accumulated into a new normal. Not perfect. I still had bad days, still struggled with trust and intimacy, still carried scars, both visible and invisible. But normal in the sense of ordinary life, with its mixture of joy and sorrow, challenge and comfort, disappointment and triumph. I was 55 when I met Robert, a kind man, 10 years my senior, who'd lost his wife to cancer several years earlier. We met at the library of all places, both reaching for the same book on the gardening shelf. We started with coffee, progressed to dinner, slowly built a friendship that eventually became something more. Dating at 55 after decades of abuse was surprised, surreal. I kept waiting for red flags, for signs that Robert would transform into Henry. But he never did. He was patient with my boundaries, respectful of my history, content to move at whatever pace I needed. He didn't try to control or criticize or diminish me. He just liked me as I was and showed it in hundreds of small, consistent ways. We didn't marry. Neither of us felt the need for legal entanglements at our age. But we built a romantic partnership that lasted until his death in 2015. Those 10 years with Robert showed me what healthy relationships could look like, what love felt like when it wasn't twisted up with fear and control. Jenny had 2 children, giving me the happy joy of being a grandmother. Michael married a wonderful woman named Sarah and had 3 kids of his own. I was happy with grandchildren who knew me only as Grandma Linda, who gives great hugs and tells funny stories, with no knowledge of the frightened, beaten woman I'd once been. I retired from the medical supply company in 2016 at 63 with a modest pension and Social Security that allowed me to live comfortably in a small house I'd purchased in 2010. I spent my retirement volunteering, gardening, traveling occasionally, and spending time with family. Henry died in 2019 of liver failure, his decades of heavy drinking finally catching up with him. I didn't attend the funeral. I felt no satisfaction in his death, but no grief either. Just a distant acknowledgement that a chapter of my life was finally completely closed. I'm 72 now, looking back on a life that split into before and after the night I escaped. The before years were full of pain and fear and survival. The after years, now more numerous than the before, have been full of happy growth and healing and genuine happiness. I'm not the girl I was at 21, and I'm not the frightened woman I was at 45. I'm something entirely different. A survivor who became a thriver, a victim who became an advocate, a woman who lost herself for decades and then did the hard work of finding herself again. You know, sitting here now in my comfortable little house with pictures of my grandchildren on the walls and a garden outside that I planted with my own hands, it's hard sometimes to believe I'm the same person who fled into that frozen February night with nothing but hope and terror. But I am. We contain multitudes, as the poet said. We're all the versions of ourselves we've ever been, carrying them forward, learning from them, building on them. If I could go back and talk to that 45-year-old woman in the shelter, terrified and uncertain and convinced she'd made a terrible mistake, I'd tell her this: you're stronger than you know. The fear you feel right now is real, but it's not the whole truth. The truth is that you survived 23 years of what was meant to break you, and it didn't. You're still here. You're still fighting. You're still capable of building something new. I'd tell her that the next years will be hard in ways she can't imagine, but also beautiful in ways she can't predict. That she'll discover strengths she didn't know she had. That she'll build relationships based on respect instead of fear. That she'll wake up one day and realize she hasn't flinched at a raised voice or apologized for existing, and that small victory will feel enormous. I tell her that age is not a barrier to starting over. That 45 is not too old to go back to school, change careers, learn to be yourself. That the decades ahead hopeful more possibility than all the years behind, because they're years she gets to choose rather than endure. I tell her about her grandchildren who'll call her strong and brave and wonderful, about Jenny's career helping other women escape abuse, about Michael's hopeful, happy marriage and his gentleness with his own children, breaking the cycle that could have continued, about the hundreds of women she'll meet in support groups and at the shelter, women who'll thank her for sharing her story, for making them feel less alone. I'd tell her that healing isn't linear, that there will be setbacks and bad days and moments when the trauma resurfaces, but that overall, the trajectory is upward, that each year gets a little easier, a little lighter, a little more filled with happy joy rather than just the absence of fear. Most importantly, I'd tell her what I wish someone had told me decades earlier. You deserve better. Not someday when you've earned it through suffering, not if you meet certain conditions or achieve certain goals. Right now, exactly as you are, you deserve safety and respect and love and freedom. You deserve a life that doesn't require constant vigilance and self-erasure. You deserve to take up space in the world without apologizing for your existence. The lessons I learned through this journey aren't just for women fleeing domestic violence, though I hope my story reaches women in that situation. They're for anyone who's ever felt trapped, powerless, convinced that their circumstances define their possibilities. They're for anyone who's ever thought it was too late to change, too hard to start over, too impossible to become someone different. Here's what I know now that I didn't know then. It's never too late. I started rebuilding my life at 45. Others start at 60 or 70 or 80. Age is not a barrier to transformation. Fear is. And fear, while valid and real, doesn't have to be permanent or defining. You're stronger than you think. The fact that you've survived this long, endured this much, kept going despite everything, that's proof of strength, not weakness. Victims aren't weak. We're incredibly strong. We just haven't had the opportunity to direct that strength toward building instead of enduring. Small steps count. You don't have to have everything figured out before you start. You don't need a perfect plan or ideal circumstances. You just need to take the next right step, and then the next, and then the next. Eventually, those steps add up to a journey you couldn't have imagined at the beginning. Community matters. I couldn't have done this alone. I needed Dorothy and Susan and Carol and Maria and my children and support groups and strangers who showed kindness when I needed it most. We're not meant to survive in isolation. Reaching out, accepting help, building connections, these aren't signs of weakness. They're confident acts of wisdom. Your story doesn't end where trauma wants it to. The abuse, the fear, the years of pain, those are chapters, not the whole book. You get to write new chapters. You get to create plot twists. You get to have a redemption arc and a happy ending, or at least a satisfying middle and the promise of better ahead. You deserve better. This is the hardest lesson to learn and the most important one to internalize. Not conditionally, not eventually. Not if you just try harder or become more perfect or finally do enough to earn it. Right now, you deserve safety, respect, love, freedom, joy, peace, and all the other things that should be basic human rights, but feel like impossible luxuries when you're trapped in abuse. If you're in a situation like I was, whether it's domestic violence or any other form of control and fear, please know that escape is possible. It won't be easy. It might be the hardest thing you ever do, but it's achievable, and there are people and resources ready to help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24/7 at 1-800-799-7233. Local shelters exist in every state. Legal aid organizations can help even if you have no money. Support groups can show you that you're not alone. And if you're not in that situation but know someone who is, please be patient and kind. Don't judge us for staying. Don't demand we leave before we're ready. Don't minimize what we're experiencing or suggest simple solutions to complex problems. Just let us know you see us, you believe us, and you'll be there when we're ready to reach out. Sometimes that knowledge is the lifeline that makes survival possible. Before I close the story, I want to say something to everyone who's listened this far. Thank you. Thank you for witnessing my journey, for caring about an older woman's story, for believing that lives like mine matter and transformations like mine are possible. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or see something differently, please take a moment to hit that like button and let me know in the comments. Tell me what you thought, or where you're watching from, or what your own journey has taught you. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of women who survived what they weren't supposed to survive, who built lives from nothing, who proved it's never too late to start over, please subscribe to this channel. Your support helps these stories reach the women who need them most, and that's work that matters more than I can express. I'm 72 years old now, and my life is quiet and peaceful and mine. I wake up each morning in my own house, make my own decisions, live according to my own values and desires. I spend time with my children and grandchildren, volunteer at the shelter, tend my garden, read books I choose because they interest me. I laugh more than I cry. I feel safe more than I feel afraid. I exist fully and completely as myself, not as someone's possession or target. The girl I was at 21 dreamed of teaching and making a difference. In a roundabout way, I suppose I've done both. I never got the classroom I imagined, but I've taught through example that starting over is possible, that age doesn't diminish worth, that women are capable of surviving and thriving despite everything designed to break us. And I've made a difference to my children who grew up to be kind and healthy adults, to my grandchildren who'll never know abuse as normal, to the women I've mentored at the shelter who've told me my story gave them hope. That's not the life I planned, but it's a happy life, a hard-won life, a life I've fought for and built and claimed as my own. And I wouldn't trade it for anything. It's never too late to escape, never too late to start over, never too late to remember you're worth saving, never too late to build the life you deserve. I'm Linda Baker, soon to be Linda Morrison again when I finish the name change paperwork I've been putting off. I'm 72 years old. I'm a survivor, a mother, a grandmother, a volunteer, a friend, and most importantly, I'm free. And if I can do it, hopeful, so can you.